Before clocks, time had a voice, and it spoke in the deep, resonant tone of a cathedral bell. In medieval Europe, these massive bronze instruments were the unseen governors of daily life, their peals dictating when a city woke, worked, prayed, and slept. By the end of this story, you will understand how an invisible architecture of sound controlled society for centuries. We will uncover why the rite to cast a bell was a sacred ritual, and how the very air became a medium of power. What does it mean for a civilization to be ruled not by sight, but by sound? Before the first hint of sun touched the rooftops, the town lay in a profound, almost deafening silence. Then it came, a single, deep toll that shattered the stillness, rolling across the sleeping city. This was the call to prayer for the monks, the first official sound of the day. But its meaning stretched far beyond the monastery walls. That resonant peal was the starting gun for the entire community, the moment when the authority of the church began its daily reign over time itself. This auditory command was made possible by a quiet revolution in metalworking. Early medieval bell founders perfected the art of casting bronze into massive, precisely tuned forms. They discovered that a bell's voice, its tone and its carrying power, depended on a delicate balance of shape, thickness, and the exact alloy of its metal. A well-cast bell did not merely make a noise, it created a sustained, low-frequency note that could travel for miles, cutting through wind and weather to reach the farthest fields. This was a monumental leap in technology. It rendered older methods, like the sundial that was useless on a cloudy day, or the human crier whose voice was lost in a crowded market, completely obsolete. The cathedral, with its towering spire, became the acoustic heart of the entire region, its voice the most reliable and far-reaching signal people had ever known. With every toll that marked the hours for prayer, for opening the markets, or for the curfew, the church was not just organizing time, it was demonstrating its unparalleled reach. The very air became its medium, and the sound that filled it, a gentle but constant reminder of who held the power to structure reality itself. Deep within the monastery walls, a revolution in time was being quietly engineered. Monks lived by a rigorous schedule known as the horologia, a cycle of 7 prayer services called the Divine Office that sliced the day and night into measured segments. This was not a life guided by the sun or the seasons, but by a new man-made rhythm of devotion. The first service, vigils, occurred in the profound darkness of the middle of the night. Then came lauds at daybreak, prime in the early morning, and so on through the hours, culminating in compline as the final darkness fell. This intricate dance of prayer required a conductor, a signal that could reach every monk, whether in the fields, the scriptorium, or the chapel. The bell was that perfect conductor. Its voice cut through fog, rain, and darkness with an authority no human crier could match, synchronizing the entire community in a shared, sacred tempo. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational text for Western monasticism, explicitly codified this auditory discipline. It demanded strict obedience to the bell's call, teaching that the sound itself was a divine summons, an interruption of one's own will for a higher purpose. This constant, daily practice did something remarkable to the human mind. It began to internalize a new relationship with time itself, one based on abstract division and unwavering regularity, rather than the fluid, organic cues of the natural world. The monk rushing to chapel at the sound of the bell was learning to think in segments, in appointments, in a schedule. And this precise, bell-governed framework did not stay locked behind monastery gates. As towns grew up around these spiritual centers, the urban churches adopted the same pattern, marking the hours for the laity with their own peals. The monastic bell became the prototype, its rhythmic tolling slowly training an entire civilization to live by the clock, embedding the church's authority into the very consciousness of medieval people, one resonant ring at a time. The transformation from raw metal to divine voice began in a foundry that was part workshop, part temple. Here, amid scorching heat and the acrid smell of molten bronze, master craftsmen performed a ritual that blended precise science with profound faith. The creation of a bell was never merely a technical task. It was a spiritual undertaking, a ceremony to birth an instrument that would speak for God. The metal itself was a sacred recipe, a bronze alloy typically of 78% copper and 22% tin, known for its sonorous ring and durability. But before the metals even touched the crucible, they were often purified with holy water, their mixture blessed by a priest to ensure the final product was free from any spiritual taint. The casting process was a high-stakes gamble that could take weeks. Artisans first built a core of brick and clay, shaping it into the bell's inner form. Over this, they carefully crafted a false model of wax and tallow, sculpting the bell's exact profile. This was then encased in a final mold of fire-resistant clay. When the furnace was heated to a searing temperature, the wax model would melt away, leaving a perfect hollow cavity between the core and the outer cope, ready to receive the liquid bronze. The moment of the pour was the climax of the entire ritual. The entire community might gather, praying as the glowing, orange-white metal flowed from the furnace into the waiting mold buried in a casting pit. It was a dangerous, awe-inspiring spectacle, a baptism by fire. The bell was not just being made, it was being born. This sacred nature was then permanently etched into its form. Bells were often inscribed with Latin prayers, the names of saints, or protective invocations. They were decorated with intricate friezes depicting biblical scenes, crosses, and sometimes the faces of evangelists. These were not mere decorations, they were a permanent sermon in metal, a visual representation of the theological messages the bell would acoustically proclaim for centuries. The largest and most important bells were even given personal names like saints or kings, and were treated as quasi-sacred members of the community. Their casting required such specialized, almost mystical knowledge that the bell founders themselves were figures of immense respect. This expertise further elevated the status of the church that could commission such a marvel. Through this alchemy of faith and fire, the church physically manifested its authority, forging an object that was both a technological masterpiece and a holy relic. The bell's voice was not just sound, it was sanctified power given a physical form, a governing presence forged in a single, miraculous act of creation. The sound of a great cathedral bell did not simply fade into silence, it carved out a distinct territory in the air itself. Picture invisible, concentric rings spreading from the bell tower, each marking a different degree of its authority. The loudest, most immediate peal governed the church square and the closest streets, a zone of absolute auditory command. Further out, the sound softened as it rolled over fields and forests, its power diminishing with every mile until it was just a faint, almost ghostly echo on the distant horizon. This was the acoustic territory of the church, a realm defined not by walls or fences, but by the physical reach of a bronze voice. Within this territory, different bells had specific jobs and specific ranges. A small, high-pitched bell might call the local parish to a quick mass, its sound sharp and localized, but the great burden, the massive bass bell in the tower, had a far more important role. Its deep, low-frequency toll was the one that could travel for miles, marking the major canonical hours for prayer and signaling critical events to the entire region. This created a layered system of governance through sound. The daily rhythm of life was not the same everywhere. It was dictated by how clearly you could hear the bell. A farmer working a field at the very edge of its range lived in a more fluid, ambiguous time, his schedule loosely tethered to a distant sound. A merchant in the town center, however, lived by its strict, inescapable rhythm. The effectiveness of this system was constantly tested by the real world. Geography was a primary challenge. A hilltop cathedral could project its voice across a vast basin, while a church in a deep valley found its influence acoustically limited. Thick forests could muffle the sound, and heavy rain or snow would absorb its energy, shrinking the bell's effective territory on the very days it was needed most. To combat this, churches became strategic about placement, building towers as high as possible and sometimes even establishing secondary bell towers in outlying areas to act as acoustic relays, extending the reach of the central authority. This concept had a formal name, the banlieue. This term literally meant the area where the ban or the authority of the Lord or the church could be heard. Your legal obligations, your safety, your very identity within the community were often defined by whether you lived within earshot of the bell. For instance, the sound of the curfew bell marked the time when the gates would be locked and all fires had to be covered. If you lived within the banlieue and could hear that bell, you were bound by its law. The case of a cathedral like Notre Dame in Paris is a powerful example. Its great bell could be heard across the entire Isle de la Cité and deep into both the left and right banks, its sound mapping the commercial and spiritual heart of the city. The limits of its clearest ring effectively outlined the zone of the church's most immediate and direct control. This created a unique form of power, an invisible cartography of influence that everyone could hear and feel, but no one could see or touch. It was a tangible realm with no physical boundaries, where authority was carried on the wind and measured by the human ear. The midday peal of the great bell transformed the bustling town square into a stage for civic order. As the last resonant note faded, the market stalls officially opened, the city guard changed its watch, and the courthouse doors swung wide. This was not a call to prayer, but a command to commerce, to justice, to the very machinery of urban life. The bell had seamlessly expanded its role from a sacred timekeeper to the primary instrument of civil administration. To manage this complex new schedule, towns developed intricate auditory codes, a language of rings that everyone could understand. A rapid, urgent series of strikes might signal a fire, sending citizens rushing with buckets to form a water chain. A slow, solemn toll could announce a public execution, drawing a somber crowd to the main square. 3 clear peals might mark the start of the court session, while 2 quick ones could indicate the day's market was closing. This sonic language was a masterpiece of social engineering, allowing a largely illiterate population to participate in a sophisticated communal calendar. The regulation of daily life was profound. The bell dictated the start and end of the artisan's workday, ensuring a standard for labor. It governed when bread could be sold and when the butchers had to clear their stalls, protecting public health. It summoned citizens to hear proclamations from the town council or to gather for militia duty in times of threat. This shared temporal framework was the invisible infrastructure that made dense urban living possible, coordinating thousands of people in a synchronized dance of production, trade, and governance. The civic bell's voice thus represented a dual promise. Its ring was a signal of opportunity, the chance to trade, to earn, to participate in the community. Yet it was equally a sound of obligation, a reminder of duties to be performed and laws to be obeyed. It was the sound of both freedom and control woven into the same bronze tone. This auditory governance bound the community together, creating a rhythm of collective life where every citizen, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest laborer, moved to the same immutable beat. A bell's authority did not end with the setting sun or the close of market. Its voice shaped the entire year, turning the passage of seasons into a vast, unfolding symphony of sacred time. The same bell that marked the hours for prayer on an ordinary Tuesday would ring with a completely different pattern during Advent or Lent, its rhythm and frequency signaling the changing spiritual seasons to every listening ear. This was an auditory calendar, a system where the very soundscape of a town shifted in accordance with the liturgical year. During the summer weeks of Lent, for example, the bells were often silenced, their voices stilled in a collective act of mourning and reflection. This created a profound sensory void, making their triumphant return at the Easter Vigil an explosion of joy that was not just seen but heard, a sonic resurrection that shook the entire community. Conversely, on major feast days like Christmas or the feast of a patron saint, the bells would ring in a complex celebratory cascade known as a peal, a sustained, joyous noise that could last for hours, marking the day as set apart from all others. This changing sonic landscape did more than just announce dates. It orchestrated the emotional and spiritual rhythm of the entire community, aligning every individual's inner life with the church's sacred timeline. This auditory calendar was brilliantly interwoven with the older, agricultural cycles that had always governed rural life. The bells ringing for the feast of St. George in the spring might coincide with the beginning of planting, while the harvest festivals in the autumn were sanctified by their own special peals. The church did not replace the farmer's calendar, it absorbed and sanctified it, creating a harmonious blend of sacred and profane time. A peasant sowing his fields was not just following the sun, he was participating in a divine rhythm announced by the bell tower, his labor framed as an act woven into a larger, holy pattern. This intricate system provided a deep sense of psychological stability in a world fraught with disease, famine, and uncertainty. The predictable return of the Advent bells, the Lenten silence, and the Easter clamor created a reassuring cycle of death and rebirth, of penance and celebration. No matter how harsh the winter or how poor the harvest, the sound of the bells promised a cosmic order that transcended daily troubles, and in doing so, it continually reinforced a fundamental truth of medieval life, that the Church was the ultimate arbiter of time itself, the institution that gave meaning and structure to every moment, from the most mundane hour to the holiest season. The yearly journey of the soul was mapped not on parchment, but in the air, heard by all and governed by the unwavering voice of bronze. That resonant authority echoing across the rooftops did not come for free. The power to mark time was underpinned by a complex financial system, a quiet economy of devotion and coin that kept the bells swinging. Every aspect of this auditory network, from the casting of the bronze to the daily labor of the ringers, required substantial and continuous funding. Pious donations were the lifeblood of this system. Wealthy merchants and noble families often made bequests in their wills specifically for the founding of a new bell or the upkeep of the tower, seeing it as a direct investment in their spiritual salvation and a lasting monument to their name. These were not anonymous gifts. A bell endowed by a wealthy patron might even bear their family crest or a personal inscription, turning a tool of communal time into a permanent symbol of private piety and social status. This created a powerful cycle of patronage, where the church's spiritual authority was financially reinforced by the elite, who in turn gained prestige and a form of immortality in bronze. The operation itself required a paid workforce. While monks might pull the ropes in a monastery, urban cathedrals and churches employed professional bell ringers. This was a skilled trade demanding physical strength, a precise sense of rhythm, and an understanding of the complex codes that governed the bell's signals. These men were paid for their services, and their positions could become valuable posts, sometimes passed down through families or granted as political favors. The entire ecosystem of trades surrounding the bells, the founders who cast them, the carpenters who maintained the massive wooden frames, the masons who repaired the towers, all operated under the watchful eye and financial control of the church. This ecclesiastical oversight was crucial. It ensured that the techniques, the schedules, and the very sound of the bells remained a monopoly. The staggering cost of founding a single great bell, a process that could consume the equivalent of a wealthy estate's annual income, was the ultimate barrier to entry. No town guild, no secular lord, no competing institution could easily afford to create a rival time signaling network of similar reach and authority. The economics of the system, therefore, deliberately cemented the existing power structure. The ability to govern time was not just a spiritual or technological achievement. It was a financial one, paid for by the faithful and managed by the church to ensure that its voice remained the only one that truly mattered. But that bronze voice was not always guaranteed to speak. The true measure of its power was revealed most starkly in the terrifying moments it was forced into silence. When a bell was stilled by royal decree, papal interdict, or the ropes of angry rebels, the familiar world of sound and time fell into chaos. Imagine a town waking not to the call to prayer, but to an unnerving quiet. The market does not know when to open. Workers linger, unsure when their labor officially begins. The day feels unmoored, its structure dissolved. This disorientation was the deliberate goal of one of the medieval church's most powerful weapons, the interdict. During a major dispute between a pope and a king, the pope could place an entire region under an interdict. This was a spiritual lockdown. The sacraments were suspended, and the church bells were silenced. For a community utterly dependent on that sound, the effect was psychologically devastating. The silence was not peaceful, it was punitive, a blanket of spiritual dread thrown over the entire population. The bell's absence was a constant, audible reminder that their rulers' conflict with the church had cut them off from divine grace. This put immense pressure on the king from his own people, who lived in a disorienting void, desperate for the return of the familiar rhythm that governed their lives and their souls. Secular authorities also learned to wield this acoustic weapon. A rebellious town that defied its feudal lord might find its bell tower seized, its bells forbidden to ring. This was more than a simple punishment. It was a symbolic castration of the community's identity and autonomy. Without its bells, the town could not coordinate its defense, regulate its commerce, or mark its own time. It was rendered acoustically helpless, forced back into a state of temporal chaos that demonstrated its total dependence on the Lord's permission to function as a society. This tactic revealed a crucial truth: the control of time was a primary lever of political power, and sometimes the rebellion came from below. During popular uprisings, like the Jacquerie in France or the Peasants' Revolt in England, angry mobs often targeted the symbols of their oppression. They did not just storm castles, they frequently stormed church towers. To silence or destroy a bell was to attack the very instrument that regimented their labor and enforced the authority of the church and state. It was a direct assault on the auditory machinery of control. In one documented case, rebels did not just break a bell, they symbolically beheaded it, treating it as a living representative of the ruling class. These acts of acoustic rebellion prove how deeply the medieval psyche understood the connection between sound and power. The bell was not a passive timepiece, it was an active governor. Its voice maintained order, and its silence, whether imposed from above or demanded from below, created a vacuum where the old rules no longer applied, revealing just how fragile the fabric of medieval society really was when its unifying rhythm was taken away. The sundial was a fair-weather friend, utterly useless under a blanket of clouds or in the dead of night. Water clocks could freeze in winter or run slow as their mechanisms clogged. For a society yearning for order, these early timekeeping methods were frustratingly tied to the whims of nature. The bell's voice broke these chains. It was a liberation from the sun and the elements, a signal that could pierce through fog, rain, and darkness with unwavering consistency. This was the true technological revolution, the moment when time became a reliable, man-made constant rather than a natural variable. Then, in the 13th century, another leap forward occurred with the birth of the mechanical clock. These early machines, driven by weights and regulated by a foliot, a primitive swinging bar, were marvels of iron and ingenuity. Their most immediate and profound application was not to show time on a dial for people to read, but to automate the striking of the great bell in the tower. Now the bell could ring the hours without a human hand ever touching a rope, its voice governed by the relentless, impersonal precision of geared wheels. This automation was a game-changer. The accuracy of the canonical hours improved dramatically, no longer subject to a tired monk's judgment of the stars or a water clock's sluggish flow. This newfound precision created incredible new possibilities for social coordination. Merchants could agree on meeting times with confidence, guilds could standardize the length of the workday, and entire cities could synchronize their activities to a degree previously unimaginable. Yet this wonderful consistency came with a hidden cost, a deepening of societal dependence. The church and the great cathedrals were virtually the only institutions with the immense wealth, the skilled artisans, and the permanent infrastructure required to install and maintain these fantastically complex and expensive machines. A mechanical clock was not just a device, it was a monumental investment. This technological monopoly meant that the very source of this new, precise time remained firmly in ecclesiastical hands. The steady, automated tolling from the bell tower was a constant acoustic reminder that the church was not just the guardian of sacred time, but had now become the master of mechanical time as well. The pursuit of perfect order had delivered society even more completely into the hands of the institution that could provide it. The psychological power of the bell lay in its unique ability to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to the body. A shout or a written decree could be ignored or argued with, but the deep, resonant vibration of a great bell was a physical force you felt in your chest. It did not request your attention, it commanded it, reaching you whether you were indoors or out, awake or asleep, pious or skeptical. This created a form of governance that operated on a primal, sensory level. The sound was the law, and its authority was felt before it was even understood. The specific tone and rhythm of a bell could trigger an immediate, almost instinctual reaction. The frantic, chaotic clanging of the tocsin, the alarm bell, did not need to be translated. That sound sparked a visceral fear, a rush of adrenaline that sent people running for water or weapons before a single word of explanation could be shouted. Conversely, the slow, measured toll for a funeral cast a blanket of collective sorrow over the entire town, slowing footsteps and lowering voices in a shared, unspoken ritual of mourning. The call to prayer, with its steady, predictable cadence, triggered a different set of reflexes entirely. A baker would instinctively wipe his flour-dusted hands, a merchant would pause his haggling, and a mother would usher her children indoors, all responding to a deeply ingrained behavioral cue. This was social control woven into the very fabric of daily experience. The omnipresence of this sound meant there was no escape from its influence. Unlike a soldier who could only patrol one street at a time, the bell's voice was everywhere at once, a constant, ambient reminder of the power structure. It followed the farmer into his field, the weaver into her workshop, and the child at play. There was no need for a vast network of enforcers when the primary instrument of order was carried on the air itself, training an entire population to regulate their own behavior in response to a simple, recurring sound. This auditory conditioning created a kind of acoustic obedience, a world where the rhythm of life was not a personal choice but a collective performance, directed by an unseen ringer in a distant tower. The very streets and squares of a medieval city were shaped by the need to hear its governing voice. Urban geography was not just a matter of walls and roads, it was an exercise in acoustic design, with the cathedral or main church bell tower serving as the undisputed heart. This was the command center, and the city grew outward from it in rings defined by the clarity of its sound. The most valuable real estate, the central marketplace, the town hall, and the homes of the elite were always clustered within the clearest earshot of the primary bells. Here, the signal was strongest, the information most immediate, and the authority of the sound most direct. To live and work in this core acoustic zone was to be at the center of power, commerce, and communal life. Your address was, in a very real sense, a measure of your auditory privilege. As you moved further from the center, the sound grew fainter, and the urban fabric changed. The narrow, winding streets of artisan quarters might catch only an echo of the major hours, while the sprawling, informal settlements outside the city walls lived in a temporal haze, their connection to the official schedule tenuous at best. This created an unseen social map. The butcher who could hear the market bell perfectly from his shop had a distinct economic advantage over a competitor on the city's edge who might miss its opening peal. A court official living near the tower was always punctual for sessions, while a laborer in a distant suburb relied on guesswork. This auditory access subtly stratified society, creating a hierarchy where proximity to the sound meant proximity to power and opportunity. Town planners and masons were acutely aware of this acoustic reality. They did not build randomly. The great open plaza before a cathedral was not just for gathering crowds, it was a vital acoustic chamber, a broad, flat surface that allowed the bell's voice to travel unimpeded into the surrounding streets. Major thoroughfares were often laid out like spokes from this central hub, acting as natural sound channels to carry the peals deeper into the urban fabric. Even the placement and angle of larger buildings were sometimes considered for their ability to reflect sound, creating audible pathways that extended the bell's effective range. This conscious design reveals a profound truth. The medieval city was built not just to be seen, but to be heard. The physical environment became an amplifier for a single, dominant voice, ensuring that the rhythm of power resonated through every lane and alley, structuring not only the hours of the day but the very ground beneath everyone's feet. Every bell had its own name and its own distinct voice in a complex acoustic conversation. This was no random clanging, but a sophisticated language of bronze where the number of bells used, their sequence, and the rhythm of their strikes conveyed specific, urgent meanings to a listening population. Just as you might recognize a friend's voice in a crowded room, medieval townspeople could instantly identify the message embedded in the peals echoing through their streets. A single, deep bell tolling at a slow, steady pace meant a death in the community, but the language was far more nuanced than that. The age and status of the deceased were communicated through subtle variations. For a child, the bell might ring in a lighter, more rapid tone, a sound of tragic innocence. For the passing of a prominent citizen or noble, the great burden would sound with a profound, measured gravity, each resonant boom a marker of social standing that everyone understood. This auditory code extended to every aspect of life. The joyous, cascading chaos of all the bells ringing together in a peal could only mean a major feast day or a royal celebration. A sharp, frantic, and uninterrupted ringing from a single bell was the universal signal for fire, sending citizens scrambling into action. 3 clear strikes, a pause, and then 3 more might indicate the start of a public market, while a specific pattern from a smaller bell could summon the town council to an emergency meeting. This shared literacy was not taught in schools, it was absorbed through a lifetime of daily exposure. A child grew up learning that one sound meant it was time to pray, another meant danger, and a third meant celebration. This created an incredibly strong bond of community cohesion. Everyone, regardless of literacy or social class, was privy to the same vital information at the same moment, united by a common understanding of the sounds that shaped their world. Yet this very cohesion had a controlling dimension. The authority to decide which bell pattern to use, and thus what message to send, rested solely with the church and town officials. They were the speakers of this language, while the populace were its listeners. A rebellion could not be announced through the bells, only suppressed by their alarm. The death of a dissenter would not receive the same solemn toll as the death of a bishop. The complexity of the system, for all its beauty, ensured that the final interpretation of events remained in the hands of the powers that rang the bells, making the air itself a medium of both community and control. The sound of the bell was not just a call to prayer or a marker of time, it was also the voice of the law itself. In the town square, a specific, sharp toll would ring out, a sound that every citizen recognized as a summons to the courthouse. This was the ban bell, its authority rooted in the ancient concept of the ban, the Lord's power to command and judge. When it sounded, all other activities were expected to cease as the community gathered to witness justice being administered. The bell did not merely announce the court's session, it actively created the legal space in which that court operated. Its audible reach defined the boundaries of jurisdiction, meaning that anyone who could hear the ban bell was subject to its call and bound by the verdicts it heralded. This transformed the abstract idea of the law into a tangible, sensory experience, a force that arrived on the air and demanded a collective response. The legal process was choreographed by this bronze timekeeper. A distinct sequence of peals would mark the court's opening, a sound that commanded silence and attention in the public square. As proceedings unfolded, the bell might ring again to signal the swearing of oaths, lending its perceived sanctity to the words of the witnesses. And finally, a definitive toll would announce the rendering of a verdict, its tone often reflecting the judgment's severity. In some regions, this connection between the bell and the law was even more literal. Important oaths were sometimes sworn with a hand upon the bell itself, as if its metal could detect a lie and ring out in protest. A convicted wrongdoer might be sentenced not to prison, but to pay for the casting of a new bell, a form of restitution that turned their crime into a permanent, auditory monument to the justice they had broken. This practice physically wove the consequences of transgression back into the very fabric of communal order. This regular, predictable rhythm of judicial bells played a deeper psychological role, reinforcing the system's legitimacy. Just as the canonical hours structured the day for prayer, the court bell structured the week or the month for justice. Its reliable return created an expectation of order and fairness, a belief that disputes would be heard and wrongs would be addressed according to a known and immutable schedule. This auditory predictability made the law feel as constant and dependable as the rising sun, fostering a sense of stability that was crucial for social cohesion. The sound of the ban bell was therefore more than a signal. It was the audible embodiment of the social contract. a reminder that order was being maintained and that every member of the community, from the highest to the lowest, was ultimately accountable to the same governing voice. The soundscape of a medieval town was not a democratic chorus, but a carefully orchestrated hierarchy of bronze voices. At the apex stood the great cathedral bells, whose authority blanketed entire regions, their deep resonance the undisputed sound of power. Far below them in both size and influence were the smaller parish bells, their reach confined to a single neighborhood or village. This acoustic disparity was a direct reflection of the rigid social and ecclesiastical order. A humble parish church was forbidden from casting or ringing a bell that could rival the cathedral's, a rule enforced to maintain a clear auditory chain of command. The right to ring bells at certain hours or to use specific complex patterns became a fiercely guarded privilege. Monastic orders, wealthy abbeys, and powerful cathedrals often engaged in protracted legal battles over these ringing rights, arguing over who had the authority to mark the most important hours of the day. Controlling the sound was equivalent to controlling time itself, and no institution was willing to cede that power lightly. The men who pulled the ropes occupied a unique and respected social niche. The bell ringer was far more than a simple laborer. He was a master of a complex acoustic code. His role demanded immense physical strength to control massive bells weighing thousands of pounds, a precise musical ear to maintain their rhythmic patterns, and a trusted character, for he held the community's communicative lifeline in his hands. In many towns, this position was a hereditary office, passed from father to son, cementing the family's status as essential custodians of public order. Their specialized knowledge made them invaluable, and they were often paid handsomely, sometimes even receiving a special allowance of wine or bread to sustain them during their strenuous duties. The bell ringer stood at the intersection of spiritual authority and civic function, a figure who commanded respect because he controlled the very rhythm of life. Where you lived in the town directly shaped your relationship with this auditory governance. The wealthy and powerful, the merchants, nobles, and high-ranking clergy invariably resided in the central districts within the clearest earshot of the primary bell towers. For them, the sound was immediate, unambiguous, and inescapable. It integrated seamlessly into their daily routines, a constant and precise companion. But for the poor who were pushed to the city's crowded outskirts or the sprawling settlements beyond the walls, the experience was profoundly different. The bells reached them as faint, muddled echoes. The call to prayer might arrive minutes late, distorted by the wind. The urgent clang of an alarm could be missed entirely. This auditory marginalization meant the poor lived in a more fluid, less regulated time, simultaneously freer from immediate control, yet also more disconnected from the rapid flow of information and commerce. The bell's command was not a sharp directive for them, but a distant suggestion. This created a world where your social class determined your temporal reality. A duke in his central manor and a tanner in his peripheral shack may have heard the same great bell, but they did not listen to the same message. For the duke, it was a precise instrument of management. For the tanner, it was a faint reminder of a power structure that governed from a distance. The hierarchy of access ensured that the unifying voice of the bell, while heard by all, did not govern all equally, etching the lines of social stratification not just in stone and law, but in the very quality of the air everyone breathed. That deep, resonant toll did not feel like an imposition because it arrived as a form of psychological comfort. In a world stalked by famine, plague, and violence, the bell's unwavering regularity was a promise of cosmic order. Its predictable return at prime, at noon, and at vespers carved out islands of certainty in a sea of chaos. This rhythmic pattern soothed the collective anxiety of an entire civilization, training minds to associate the sound not with oppression, but with stability and divine protection. The authority of the bell was further sanctified by its source. It did not ring from a town hall or a baron's castle, but from the house of God. Each peal was understood not as a human command, but as a divine echo, a signal blessed by the ultimate authority. This association gave the bell a profound legitimacy that no secular signal could ever hope to achieve. To disobey the call to prayer was not just a civic infraction, it was a spiritual transgression, a defiance of God's own timetable. This conditioning began at the earliest age. A medieval child learned to respond to bell signals with the same instinctual urgency as a flock of birds taking flight at a sudden noise. The sound was woven into the fabric of their earliest memories, marking meals, prayers, and the safe closing of the city gates at dusk. By the time they were adults, the response was automatic, a deeply ingrained habit that felt as natural as breathing. This early and constant exposure created a form of auditory obedience that required no soldiers to enforce it, because the enforcement had been internalized. The very physics of sound itself made this control uniquely potent. A written law could be ignored, a spoken command could be debated, but the low-frequency vibration of a great burden bell was a physical force that bypassed the conscious mind entirely. You felt it in your bones before you even processed it with your ears. This direct line to the nervous system triggered primal emotional responses, the frantic tocsin sparking instant fear, the funeral toll evoking immediate sorrow. There was no intellectual defense against a sensation that was felt as much as it was heard. This psychological architecture explains the system's remarkable endurance. For the average person, the bell was not an instrument of control they needed to resist. It was the very heartbeat of their community, a sound that structured their reality so completely that life without its rhythm became unimaginable. The power of the bell was not that it forced compliance, but that it made compliance feel like the most natural state of being. The deep toll of the cathedral bell was not the only voice that governed time. Across the Mediterranean, another sound defined the rhythm of daily life, the adhan, or the Muslim call to prayer. Issued 5 times a day from the slender heights of a minaret, the adhan shared a core function with the Christian bell, synchronizing a vast community in a shared spiritual practice. But its mechanism was profoundly different. Instead of an impersonal bronze instrument struck by a rope or a clock, the adhan was a human voice, chanted by a muezzin chosen for his piety and vocal clarity. This created a more personal, organic connection to the divine timetable, a living breath rather than a mechanical strike. The timing itself was also fluid, tied directly to the sun's position: dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and nightfall, making it a system deeply woven into the fabric of the natural world. In major Islamic cities, the calls would ripple across the rooftops from multiple mosques, creating a layered, human chorus of devotion that coordinated society without the need for a single, centralized timekeeping authority. Further east, in China, imperial authorities developed monumental systems for urban timekeeping that were entirely secular in their purpose. Vast drum towers and bell towers stood in city centers, but their signals regulated the opening and closing of markets and the changing of the night watch, serving the bureaucratic needs of the state. The technology was often brilliant, from intricate water-driven clock towers to massive incense clocks that could burn for days, marking the hours with a visual and olfactory cue rather than a purely auditory one. These systems demonstrated that the desire to impose a collective temporal order was a universal impulse of complex civilizations. So what made the European cathedral bell unique? Its power lay in a specific fusion. It combined the religious authority of the adhan with the civic regulatory function of the Chinese drum tower, all centered on a single, powerful institution, the church. And crucially, it was this system that eventually married its bronze voice to the relentless precision of the mechanical clock. This union created a new kind of time, abstract, quantifiable, and independent of human or natural cycles, that would eventually be exported across the globe. The European bell was not just a timekeeper, it was the crucible in which modern, mechanized time was forged, its voice the herald of a world where every second would soon be counted and commodified. The Black Death did not just kill people, it killed time itself. As the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, it tore apart the very social fabric that gave the bells their power. The first sign of collapse was the silence. Bell ringers, monks, and priests died in staggering numbers, leaving no one to pull the ropes or maintain the sacred schedule. The familiar calls to prayer grew erratic, then ceased altogether in many towns. The market bell no longer rang, the curfew bell fell silent, and the comforting rhythm that structured existence simply vanished. This auditory void created a profound disorientation that compounded the physical horror of the pandemic. Days bled into one another without definition, work and prayer lost their anchors, and the community's shared sense of order dissolved into a desperate, day-to-day struggle for survival. The sound that had once meant governance and divine protection was replaced by a new, terrifying sound, the specific, grim tolling of the plague bell. This was not a call to prayer, but a signal to bring out your dead. Its ring would trigger the arrival of the death cart, a sight so feared that the bell's sound itself became an omen of grief and contamination. In some cities, new acoustic codes emerged entirely, with specific bell patterns used to mark houses under quarantine, creating a sonic map of infection and fear. This was a brutal inversion of the old system, where the bell now signaled isolation and death rather than community and life. When the worst of the pestilence finally passed, the survivors faced a shattered world. The authority of the Church was deeply wounded, its promise of divine order broken by the indiscriminate mortality. Attempts to restore the old temporal patterns were often half-hearted or met with resistance from a traumatized populace. There were simply not enough people to fill all the old roles, and the social hierarchy that the bell system reinforced had been upended. Laborers, now scarce, gained new bargaining power and were less willing to submit to the rigid schedules of manorial lords. The crisis proved that the unseen architecture of auditory control was incredibly fragile. It depended entirely on a stable society, on healthy hands to ring the bells, and on a populace psychologically willing to listen and obey. The plague revealed that the governance of time was not a divine constant, but a human system, and like all human things, it could break. A new kind of time began to tick in the heart of the medieval city, its rhythm emerging not from a church tower, but from the town hall. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, a quiet revolution in metal and mechanics challenged the church's centuries-long monopoly. Wealthy merchant guilds and ambitious town councils began investing in their own magnificent machines, public clocks that stood as bold declarations of civic independence. These were not hidden away in a monastery, but installed in the most public secular space available, often high on the facade of the town hall itself for all to see. Their placement was a deliberate statement, a proclamation that the commercial and political life of the city now operated on its own schedule, measured by its own authority. The very architecture of power was shifting, and the town clock was its newest and most visible symbol. This was more than a convenience, it was a direct challenge to the ecclesiastical control of temporal order. The most profound innovation of these new clocks was the clock face itself. For the first time, time was not just something to be heard, but something to be seen. A citizen could now look up at the town hall and visually read the hour, a silent, personal act of timekeeping that did not require a bell to interpret. This visual component offered an alternative to the auditory command of the cathedral, allowing for a more individualized relationship with the hours of the day. Yet the old system did not simply vanish. The town clocks themselves were almost always married to a bell, often called the clock bell, which would automatically strike the hours. The sound was still essential for reaching those indoors or in crowded markets, but now the source of that sound was different. The message was no longer "come to prayer," but rather "the market is open, the council is in session, the workday is done." This created a fascinating and often tense duality in the urban soundscape. The deep tone of the church bell might call for vespers at the same moment the sharper chime of the town clock marked the end of the business day, creating an acoustic competition for the populace's allegiance. Disputes over ringing rights flared up repeatedly. Town councils would pass ordinances forbidding church bells from ringing during council meetings or important civic announcements, while ecclesiastical authorities would condemn the secular clocks as impious distractions from God's time. In one documented case, the canons of a cathedral complained that the new town clock bell was so loud it drowned out their own services, a sonic battle that perfectly mirrored the political struggle for influence in the late medieval world. The rise of the town clock signaled the beginning of the end for the bell's exclusive dominion. It proved that time itself could be decoupled from divine service and repurposed for civic order and commercial efficiency. The invisible governor now had a visible and very secular rival. That intricate dance of sound required a new kind of master, one who understood the deep science hidden within the bronze. Campanology, the formal study of bells, emerged from this need, blending acoustics, metallurgy, and musical theory into a singular discipline. Medieval experts discovered that a bell's voice was not a single note but a complex chord. When struck, it produced a dominant hum tone, a higher-pitched strike tone, and a series of subtle harmonics that gave each bell its unique personality. The goal of the master founder was to cast a bell where these tones harmonized perfectly, creating a sound that was both powerful and pleasing, rather than a jarring clang. This required an almost alchemical precision in the foundry. The exact shape of the bell, the curve of its lip, and the precise thickness of its walls at every point were all calculated to control these vibrations. A bell that was too thick would sound dead and muffled, while one too thin might crack under the force of its own voice. This was not guesswork, it was applied physics, perfected over generations through careful observation and recorded knowledge. The men who possessed this knowledge, the bell founders, became celebrities of their craft. A renowned founder like Geert van Woo in the Low Countries received commissions from cities and cathedrals hundreds of miles apart. His fame rested on his ability to consistently produce bells of unparalleled clarity and resonance, instruments that could be heard further and lasted longer than any others. These master artisans traveled across Europe with their teams, carrying their secret molds and alloy formulas like state secrets. A city investing in a new peal of bells was not just buying a timekeeping device, it was acquiring a sonic monument to its own prestige, and the founder who could deliver that became a figure of immense civic and cultural importance. This expertise reached its most dazzling expression in the practice of change ringing. This was not merely ringing bells in a random sequence, but executing complex mathematical permutations. A set of bells, each with a different note, would be rung in every possible order according to strict patterns. For 5 bells, this meant 120 unique changes. For 8 bells, over 40,000. This transformed the functional act of ringing into a high art form, a cerebral and physical performance that demanded immense concentration, teamwork, and mathematical skill from the ringers. The resulting cascade of sound was a living, evolving melody that demonstrated total mastery over the bronze instruments. This specialized knowledge became a new form of currency. The campanologist, whether a brilliant founder or a master ringer, held a key to the community's very identity. Their ability to manipulate sound gave them influence, placing them in the inner circles of both cathedral chapters and town councils. They were the guardians of an auditory power that everyone could hear but very few truly understood, their technical mastery ensuring that the governing voice of the bell remained as sophisticated as it was commanding. The same resonant peal that called a city to prayer could, in an instant, transform into a sound of pure terror. When sentries spotted dust on the horizon or the glint of enemy armor, they did not light a beacon, they rang the bell with a frantic, urgent rhythm known as the tocsin. This was no mere alarm, it was a sophisticated early warning system. The specific pattern of strikes could convey vital information to a listening populace. A rapid, continuous ring might signal an immediate attack, sending farmers rushing from their fields with whatever tools they could wield as weapons. A series of strikes, a pause, and then another series might indicate the direction of the threat, allowing the town's militia to muster at the correct gate or section of the walls. The bell tower itself was the perfect instrument for this defense. Its great height provided an unrivaled vantage point, making it a natural lookout post. The men stationed there could see for miles, and the bell ropes were right at hand, turning observation into immediate action. This made the tower a strategic asset of immense military value, a combination of watchtower and command center whose voice could mobilize an entire region in minutes. The coordination did not stop at the walls. In some sieges, defenders developed codes to communicate with relief forces camped beyond the enemy lines. A specific sequence of rings on a clear night could signal that supplies were low or that a sortie was planned for dawn, turning the bell into a crude but effective telegraph. Because of this profound defensive role, the capture or destruction of an enemy's bells became a primary objective in any conflict. Silencing a town's bells was not just a tactical move, it was a deeply symbolic act of domination. It severed the community's nervous system, leaving it deaf, disoriented, and unable to coordinate its resistance. Victorious armies would often loot the bells as the ultimate prize, melting them down for cannon or carrying them home as trophies. This demonstrated control over both the physical and the auditory landscape, proving that the conqueror now owned the very rhythm of life. In this way, the bell's function in warfare perfectly mirrored its role in peace. It was the sound of order, but that order now meant unified defense against a common enemy. Its voice promised not just spiritual stability, but physical protection, binding the community together in the face of existential threats and reinforcing its absolute centrality to medieval survival. The marketplace itself ran on a schedule written in sound. A specific, sharp peal from the town's central bell did not just mark the hour, it declared the market officially open, unleashing a flood of coordinated activity. This created a temporal economy, a system where the value of goods, labor, and even trust was directly tied to the bell's reliable voice. For merchants arriving from distant cities, the timing of their entrance was often announced by a special peal, alerting local buyers to new wares and potential bargains. This synchronization was the bedrock of commerce, creating predictable windows for trade that everyone could depend on. The bell even governed price changes, with a distinct ring sometimes signaling the moment when butchers had to lower their prices on unsold meat, or when bakers could begin selling the day's second batch of bread. This acoustic regulation brought a new level of order and fairness to the chaotic world of the medieval marketplace. This precise timekeeping enabled economic practices that would have been impossible otherwise. Complex credit arrangements, for instance, relied on the bell's authority. A debt note might specify repayment at the sound of the midday bell on a certain saint's day, creating a fixed, audible deadline that was recognized by all. The development of specialized bells for commerce further cemented this system. The fair bell, with its unique celebratory ring, would signal the start of a major seasonal fair, drawing merchants from across the region and temporarily resetting the local economic rules. The market bell, meanwhile, maintained the daily rhythm of trade, its opening and closing peals creating a container of time within which commerce was not just allowed, but officially sanctioned and protected. This framework was absolutely essential for the growth of medieval capitalism. It allowed for more sophisticated commercial networks to develop, as merchants in different towns could coordinate their movements and agreements based on shared, reliable time signals emanating from central bell towers. The regulation of labor through these same sounds represented an early and powerful form of management. The bell dictated the start of the artisan's workday, the timing of his meal break, and the moment his tools were to be set down. This imposed a uniform work discipline across entire guilds, balancing the economic drive for productivity with the inescapable religious obligations marked by the very same bells. The sound that called a weaver to mass also told him when his loom could legally operate, weaving the threads of faith and commerce into a single, unbreakable fabric of daily life. Rising above the crowded rooftops, the bell tower was a feat of engineering designed to make sound travel. Medieval builders faced a monumental challenge: to construct structures tall enough to project a bell's voice for miles, yet strong enough to support the immense weight and violent swinging of bronze giants that could weigh several tons. They developed revolutionary techniques, pioneering the use of stone vaulting within the towers to create a stable, resonant chamber that could withstand the constant, powerful vibrations. The tower itself became a massive musical instrument, its very architecture fine-tuned to amplify and direct the sound. To achieve this, they incorporated specific acoustic elements. The bell chamber was fitted with large, slatted openings called louvers. These were not simple windows, they were sophisticated baffles that allowed the sound to pour outwards while shielding the bells and their complex rigging from rain, snow, and destructive winds. The shape and angle of these openings were carefully calculated to channel the sound waves downward and outward, ensuring the peals washed over the city below rather than being lost to the empty sky. This was architectural design in service of pure acoustics, a physical shell crafted to govern the very movement of sound itself. The ambition for height became an obsession across Europe. A taller tower did not just provide a better vantage point, it extended the bell's acoustic territory exponentially. The race to build the highest spire was a direct competition for auditory and spiritual dominance. When the Cathedral of Chartres raised its spire, or when Lincoln Cathedral's central tower pierced the sky, these were not just acts of devotion, they were declarations of power. A city skyline dominated by a single, towering belfry was a constant visual reminder of where authority resided. A stone finger pointing heavenward that also cast a long, audible shadow over the surrounding countryside. This visual prominence perfectly reinforced the acoustic authority, the two working in concert. You could not escape the sight of the tower, just as you could not escape the sound of its bell. The governance of time became physically set in stone, an enduring monument to a system of control that was as solid and unmovable as the foundations upon which it stood. These structures were so effective that they permanently shaped the European landscape. their silhouettes remaining the defining feature of a town for centuries, long after the bells inside had ceased to be the primary regulators of daily life. Martin Luther's 95 Theses did not just challenge papal authority, they questioned the very sound of sacred time itself. The Protestant Reformation unleashed a wave of religious upheaval that directly targeted the auditory governance of the medieval church, forcing communities to choose not only their faith but also the sounds that would structure their days. Reformers like Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich saw the ringing of bells for the canonical hours as a superstitious relic of popish devotion, an empty noise that distracted from the pure word of God preached in the sermon. In his zeal to cleanse worship of what he deemed unnecessary ritual, he ordered the bells silenced, stripping the city of its familiar acoustic rhythm almost overnight. This created a profound sensory void for the citizens who had lived their entire lives by that bronze cadence. The sudden quiet was not peaceful, it was disorienting, a daily reminder that the old spiritual order had been audibly dismantled. Other reformers took a more moderate path. John Calvin in Geneva permitted bells to be rung, but he stripped them of their previous mystical significance. The bell was no longer a sacred voice summoning the faithful to a saving sacrament. It was merely a practical, civic tool for calling people to sermon or marking the time for work. Its ring was drained of its supernatural power and repurposed for communal order and moral discipline, a fundamental shift in the theology of sound. This theological conflict turned physical in waves of iconoclasm that swept through regions like the Netherlands and England. Angry mobs, inspired by sermons against idolatry, did not just smash stained glass and statues, they stormed bell towers. To these reformers, a bell inscribed with Latin prayers and the faces of saints was not a holy object but a graven image, an idol that had been worshipped for its sound. They melted down countless bells to cast cannons for their armies or to recast them as simple, unadorned instruments, visually and acoustically purifying them of their Catholic past. In England, King Henry VIII's break with Rome led to the dissolution of the monasteries, and with it, the systematic silencing of hundreds of monastic bell towers. The great abbeys, whose rhythmic calls had structured life for centuries, fell quiet, their bells seized by the crown and sold for scrap metal. This was more than an economic seizure, it was an acoustic coup, dismantling the auditory network of the old religion and asserting the king's control over the very measurement of time. Yet, in a fascinating compromise, many Lutheran regions in Germany and Scandinavia retained a deeply affectionate relationship with their bells. They continued to ring, but their purpose was redefined theologically. The sound was no longer a work that pleased God, but a gift from God, a reminder of His grace and a call to hear His word. The Lutheran Church thus preserved the sensory experience of sacred time while emptying it of its medieval Catholic meaning. This turbulent period proves that the bell was far more than a timekeeping device. It was a vessel of theological meaning, and the battle over its voice was a battle for the soul of the community. The Reformation challenged the medieval mind to hear time differently, to disentangle the ring of bronze from the ring of salvation, and in doing so, it created a new and fractured soundscape of authority across Europe. The deep resonance of a bell was believed to carve a sacred space in the very air, a protective dome that evil spirits could not cross. Villagers were utterly convinced that the deliberate, rhythmic ringing of a church bell could physically drive back an approaching thunderstorm, shattering the dark clouds and deflecting lightning. This was not a metaphor, it was a deeply held article of faith, and many a bell ringer would be summoned to his ropes not by a clock, but by the threat of a tempest, pulling with all his might to create a sonic shield over his community. This belief in the bell's supernatural power extended to healing and protection. People would travel great distances to touch a famous bell or to drink water in which a blessed bell clapper had been dipped, hoping for a cure for illness or protection from plague. The bell was not seen as a simple metal object. It was a conduit for divine force, its physical substance impregnated with holiness. This mystical authority was formally cemented by the Church in a powerful ritual, the baptism of the bell. Just as a person was christened with holy water and given a name to welcome them into the faith, so too was a new bell. A bishop or priest would anoint it with holy oils, bless it with water, and bestow upon it the name of a saint, officially welcoming it as a member of the congregation. From that moment on, the bell was no longer just St. Peter's bell in the sense of belonging to his church. It was the bell named St. Peter, a named, semi-sacred entity with its own identity and power. Stories of these baptized bells acting on their own will circulated in hushed, awe-struck tones. There were widespread tales of bells that rang miraculously at the moment of a saint's death, or ones that tolled by themselves to warn of an impending disaster or to mark a great naval victory, their sound echoing across the land long before any human messenger could arrive. In one famous legend, the bells of a sunken city were said to still be heard ringing from beneath the waves on certain holy nights, a ghostly governance from beyond the grave. This rich tapestry of folklore and miracle did more than just make for good stories. It fundamentally transformed the bell's function. When the bell rang for curfew, ignoring it was not merely breaking a town ordinance, it was risking supernatural peril. To sleep through the call to morning prayer was not just laziness, it was to turn away from a divine summons that kept the forces of darkness at bay. The mystical dimension made obedience to the bell's signal a matter of spiritual safety, weaving its authority not just into the laws of man, but into the very fabric of the cosmos, ensuring that its governance was felt in the soul as deeply as it was in the daily routine. Our modern world may seem far removed from the rule of the bell, yet its rhythm still echoes in the deepest structures of our lives. The very way we divide our day into a series of appointments and deadlines is a direct inheritance from that monastic schedule, internalized over centuries. Our 9-to-5 workday is not a natural phenomenon. It is the secular descendant of the canonical hours, a framework for labor that replaced prayer with productivity but kept the same rigid segmentation of time. The factory whistle of the Industrial Revolution was not a new invention. It was the burden bell of the new age, calling workers to their shifts with the same authoritative blast that once summoned monks to lords. Even our most urgent civic alerts, from air raid sirens to smartphone emergency broadcasts, function on the same principle as the frantic tocsin, using a unique, piercing sound to bypass rational thought and trigger an immediate collective response. This reveals a profound truth: the technology has changed, but the psychological wiring remains. We have been conditioned for hundreds of years to respond to auditory commands that structure our collective existence. The great shift has been from community time to individual time. In the medieval town, one bell governed all. Today, each of us carries a personal timekeeper in our pocket, a device that liberates us from a single, shared schedule. We can choose our own rhythms, work remotely, and ignore the noon chime if we wish. This feels like freedom, and in many ways it is. But this liberation has also fragmented the shared experience that once bound communities together. We no longer all pause at the same moment, guided by a single sound. Our rhythms are personalized, often isolating us in private temporal bubbles. Yet the old patterns persist because the need for social synchronization is fundamental. Stock markets still open and close at fixed hours, television programs air on a schedule, and entire nations still pause for a midday meal, all remnants of a world that moved to a common beat. The authority that once resided in the bell tower has not vanished. It has simply dispersed and evolved. Our time is now managed by corporate schedules, algorithmic feeds, and digital calendars that nudge us with their own form of automated bells. The control of time remains a primary lever of power. It just operates more quietly, its mechanisms hidden behind a screen. So the next time you instinctively check your watch at a certain hour or feel a jolt of anxiety at a calendar notification, remember that you are hearing a faint, digital echo of the great bronze bell, a sound that once taught an entire civilization how to live by the clock. That resonant history reveals a profound truth about power itself. The true authority of the cathedral bell was never just in its sound, but in the invisible architecture it built within the human mind. It conditioned an entire civilization to accept a shared rhythm, to internalize a schedule, and to find comfort in a predictable order that was dictated from a single, towering source. This was a governance of the spirit, more subtle and more enduring than any law written on parchment. The legacy of this system is not merely a historical curiosity. It is etched into the very foundations of our modern world. Our concept of a standardized workday, our reliance on schedules, even our collective response to emergency sirens, are all echoes of that ancient bronze cadence. We have traded the single, unifying voice of the bell tower for the personalized chimes of our digital devices, fragmenting the shared temporal experience that once bound communities together. Yet the underlying principle remains: the control of time is still a primary lever of authority, even if its mechanisms are now hidden behind screens and algorithms. So the next time you feel the pull of a deadline or the habit of a daily routine, listen closely. You are hearing the faint, enduring echo of the great bell, a ghostly reminder that the most powerful forces are often the ones we no longer think to question, the rhythms that have become so deeply woven into our lives that they feel like second nature. If this exploration of how cathedral bells governed medieval life resonated with you, I invite you to join our community of history enthusiasts. Subscribing to this channel and clicking the bell icon ensures you won't miss our future journeys into the forgotten corners of the past. Your engagement is what fuels this channel, helping us continue to uncover the hidden histories that shape our world. I would genuinely love to hear your own thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps you have experienced the power of communal bells in your own life, or maybe you can identify modern equivalents to this ancient form of auditory governance. What sounds structure your day or command your attention now? If you found this story compelling, please share it with anyone who appreciates how a single, ordinary object can reveal extraordinary truths about power, society, and the human experience. Together, let's keep listening for the deep, resonant echoes of history in the rhythm of our contemporary world.